What's up, Shred Sexies? Welcome back. Death to the Fingers. We're into the major scale workout. This thing is brutal. Basically, the ultimate exercise. It covers everything, all techniques. It's absolutely savage. I guess I woke up and I was like, nah, I don't like the world anymore. Whatever. Too bad for you. So we're going to get into what I call the fundamentals. This is everything you have to know before you can even get to the second half where we start doing combinations. If you can't do this stuff here, you're basically going to have to start here, which is going to take a while, granted, but once you start getting good at this stuff, I guarantee your playing will go into the stratosphere like mine did. So there's the major scale represented as the classical method and 3 notes per string. There is the major triad arpeggios based off the diatonic scale just on 1 string. And of course, there's the dominant 7 variants with major 7, minor 7, dominant 7, and minor 7 flat 5. And again, in the video, you'll see me flash up all of the scale charts before I do the sequence kind of thing. And listen to how I tried to play them musically. There's no metronome. There's no... there's no backing track, but I'm still trying to create phrases, little musical sentences that sort of make sense. Be like, okay, I should stop here and give myself a breather before I dive into this next section. And if you start thinking like that, like, oh, this first part, that's the first part of my sentence, I'm going to end on this note, or go to the next note of the first shape and wait there for a sec before I carry on. You know what I mean? Because that note sounds the best to end on. It sort of brings your musical idea to an end. That kind of stuff is incredibly important. This is a perfect opportunity to practice it. Don't just go into, automaton mode and just practice up and down using the sort of metronome theory. No, that's for later on to develop accuracy, stamina, and sort of precision. But when you're just getting going, you just want to sort of be like, I just want to get a feel for these sounds and these sequences, and that's what you're doing. You're starting to train your ear to be like, okay, I recognize going up here and here. So that's really the big takeaway. And of course, learning all this material. So that'll be a good time. So no more chit-chatting. Let's get into these fundamentals.
All right, in this first example, basically we're ascending using the classical method in the key of G major. So we're doing G major, A Dorian, B Phrygian, C Lydian, D Mixolydian, E Aeolian, and finally F sharp Locrian. We're ascending using each one of those shapes. And then what we're doing is descending in the next shape. But again, using the classical method, this basically allows you to ascend vertically like this and then move to the next position and move down vertically and sort of scour the fretboard up and down like that, sort of like how a satellite takes pictures of the night sky, sort of in little pieces all the time, little snapshots. That's what you're essentially trying to grab. And of course, mixed in at the end, I do a 1-4-5 chord progression, but with arpeggios. And so this is, again, using the diatonic scale theory on one string to start to gang together essentially chords as scales. That's why arpeggios show up here, because you can think of an arpeggio as a chord played like a scale. Okay, now, you know, that's a rough equivalency, but good enough for most people. Okay, so right there is a huge one. So ascend first just using the classical method, and then descend in the next shape, and then, of course, try to take on the arpeggio sequence at the end, which is going to be a killer finger workout.
All right, next on the hit list here is essentially interval scales. I'm doing it in thirds. I'm using, of course, 3 notes per string, so you have to kind of be up to snuff on that, if you will. But notice how I just don't go up and down the scale. Again, I'm trying to be musical about it, and I'm moving through the various positions, and more importantly, I'm adding in little scale fragments to connect one zone to another, also to break up the monotony. Too much of one thing gives you tunnel vision, and then when you go to do something else, there's like this moment where it's like you're staring right into the headlights, so you get blinded, and you're like, where am I again? And that could be disastrous. So the way to avoid that is to practice these two things in tandem when you're doing the intervals and then when you're just working on a scale. Now, I didn't do as much of the scale stuff as I would have liked, but I would have had it in equal measures. Oh, look, I'm going to use the scale to ascend. And when I get to the highest position, I'm going to use thirds to descend. And then be like, oh, I'm going to use fourths now to ascend, and then I'm going to use another scale to descend. So I'm constantly moving between playing the scale in intervals and also just playing the scale normally. But in this instance, it's just mostly in thirds. But again, be musical, move through the shapes. Don't just practice in one position. Practice moving through the shapes, even if you have to play the scale in thirds just on one string. Enough yip yap. Let's do it. All right, in the next example here, essentially, we're getting into extended scales. So to really get at that, you need to be good at 3 notes per string, obviously. But then, of course, you need to start to understand, oh, look, I can borrow a note from one of the adjacent systems. So in this case, Locrian and Ionian. And I can make 4 notes on one string instead of just 3. And then I can use the 3 octaves principle to start climbing up the fretboard diagonally with these little scale fragments, okay, which we call extended scales. And of course, it starts off with 3 octaves, but later on, and as you've seen me do, you can just keep going for an infinity. It never stops until you want it to. So that's a big one. But the first step has to be to recognize the sort of individual patterns. So you see me do a couple. One based on the whole step, one based on the Locrian position. I think I also do one in Phrygian, right? I also do one at, I think it's Aeolian / Mixolydian. So, you know, you got to find your own. That's part of the training process, is for you to sit there and be like, if I just borrow one note, so I have 4 notes on one string and then 3 notes. And it doesn't matter which string has 4 and then 3. And you should basically do both, where one has 4 notes and the other one has 3, and then you play 3 notes and then 4 notes. It's all good practice, and it's all time in the trenches. Let's do it up. Okay, these last two examples are pretty hard, but I know you can do it. Essentially, again, in the key of G major, we're going to ascend using the Ionian mode, using 3 notes per string, but I'm going to synthesize the scale, if you will, with the classical method. So I'm only playing 2 notes on the B and the high E, but then I'm going to add a 3rd note on the high E so I can get to the position necessary to begin coming down with a major triad arpeggio. So I'm basically superimposing the 3 notes per string scale and the classical method, if you will, with the arpeggio associated with the modal position I'm playing in. So Ionian's going to be a major triad. Obviously, Dorian and Phrygian would be a minor triad. Then you have Lydian and Mixolydian being major. Then Aeolian's minor. Locrian's going to be diminished, of course. And finally, you're back to the start again, which is major and Ionian. So putting these two things together is obviously very important as far as like a technique thing is concerned, but it also really helps, breaks down the fretboard and trains your ear again to these two sounds. You're like, this is what it sounds like when I play the chord, just as kind of like a scale, if you will. And this is what it sounds like when I actually play the scale. And there's another step that I didn't do where you could actually play the actual chord too, most closely related to, if you will, the mode you're working in. So you'd use like a major 7 raised 11 for Lydian or dominant 7 for the 5th degree. And when you did that, you'd really sort of unlock this very powerful tool for training your mind and training your ear, if you will, to recognize these sounds. And then, of course, now you have the Rosetta Stone to be like, do this scale and this arpeggio in the same position, and you'll be like, off to the races. Let's get into it. All right, I've saved the most hellish for last, of course, because it's just, it's truly evil. I'm not going to lie. I had to practice it a few times before I could even do it. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt, but I wanted to give you guys something that was challenging enough to be like, yeah, man, that sounds killer. So we're now taking the minor pentatonic scale system and we're using string skipping starting in the Ionian position. And when I get to the highest position, I'm going to do the same thing I kind of did with the previous exercise, is now stretch it out to then play 3 notes per string, but again, hybridize it using 3 and 1, which again allows me to play the scale or multiple scales, if you will, in one position, just ascending vertically. And it has a very cool sound, and it can go very, very fast later on when you get more sort of confident with the technique, if you will. So if you need sort of more help on how to do 3 and 1, that's basically Frank Gambale territory. Just go watch his videos on sweeping and you're good to go, especially stuff like sweeping pentatonics. That will absolutely unlock this technique for you. And now all I'm doing, instead of sweeping the pentatonics, I'm sort of sweeping the major scale. But it comes up with this weird sort of like hybrid scale arpeggio sound. It's neither a scale, neither an arpeggio. It's sort of in between. So it's a very cool sound, and it's a great way to practice this 3 and 1 technique, which is absolutely essential. Moving across 3 strings with 3 individual fingers, either with triads or with these types of arpeggios, is invaluable as far as a player is concerned. So make sure you practice it a lot. And of course, at the tail end, I have to do a really savage sort of arpeggio sequence. So I'm doing minor 7 at the Phrygian position. Then I jump down to Dorian and I substitute in the symmetrical shape for diminished instead of the Dorian mode. I jump down to Ionian. I play major 7, jumping down to Locrian. Of course, I'm going to do a cadence by substituting in D7 there in the Locrian position. And then, of course, I jump up and I start to do, again, symmetrical shapes using major 7 until I get to the very top. And then I'm using 3 octaves principle to come back down. So you can see I've added all the techniques, everything you basically need, alternate picking and sweeping. Now, of course, the sweeps are taking place over a much smaller area. But of course, we are also doing sort of like more straightforward 6-string ones. So, but they're still broken up too. And that's the thing. You go from like the more simplistic 1-4-5 ones we did earlier to these more sophisticated ones, because essentially the size of the sweep is reduced massively down to just 2 or 3 strings, which makes everything more challenging and difficult. So I'll let you sort of have at her as best you can. Of course, you can always hybridize any of these ideas. Just take a couple and put them together that work for you and come up with your own versions. They do not have to be these ideas. These are guidelines. So take them and sort of deconstruct them and then reconstruct them so it works for your playing style. And then start to work on these basic ideas where you see me combining a bunch of various techniques over top of a major scale using these systems to really start to unlock the fretboard based around regions, or of course connecting those regions together to move diagonally across the neck to go from point A to point B. So good times. I hope you enjoyed the video. Take things slowly. Obviously, once you get a couple shapes together, start practicing them together and it'll get a lot easier for you to start to put them all together in one big sequence. And then, of course, just have fun with it. Experiment. That's the most important thing. And above all else, practice musically. Don't just shut the mind off. Try to say something even though you're just using scales and arpeggios. There's a way to do that where it can sound beautiful. And that's really where the magic is. Can you take this really boring sort of collection of notes that's been done a couple trillion times and put some life into it? That's the real test of the musician. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you in the next one.